So, hello everybody, my name is Grant. I am a member of the Harvard Game Devs and a game designer, and I am here to give a presentation on emergent storytelling. I'm dubbing this since we had some audio difficulties on our first run, so forgive any sync issues or format or anything like that, but I'm going to do my best to keep it all in sync with the original presentation and try to get it all nice and lined up as best I can. So essentially, I want to talk about emergent storytelling, which is something I've been passionate about for the last several years, and essentially go through a couple different narrative types. Here are a couple different examples of narrative before we get to emergent. So one of the classic and kind of original narrative types stemming from other media is linear narrative. I think of Uncharted and Naughty Dog games as an excellent example, but there are plenty of others. Lots of first person shooter campaigns, often platformers have linear narratives. These are narratives that are explicitly written out by a writer or a narrative designer or anything like that, and are experienced in largely the same way by every player of the game. They may differ from person to person in the micro experiences of the narrative, but for the most part, linear narratives are authored explicitly by developers and are just like you would with a movie script or a book, taken through that way. The other side are uh, branching narratives. Branching narratives are the opposite. They are narratives in which the player is given choice in which direction the narrative goes. I think of Telltale games as an excellent example, but there are several others. The Mass Effect series has a couple of choices. The Witcher 3 had a great moment of branching, has several moments of branching narrative. Um, these are games in which the player has input in the direction the story goes, not just in how they play the game, but in explicit choices that the player makes at various points that take the story in different directions. Now, this can be done to varying degrees. In some cases, Telltale games give the illusion of like a really big choice when in actuality things tend to pan out the same way either way. But branching narrative essentially gives the player some explicit choice in still a number of explicitly authored paths, just multiple ones rather than a single one. Both of these are not to be confused with emergent narrative. Emergent narrative being narrative that is not explicitly authored by any developer of a game. Emergent narrative instead, or water cooler moments, player stories, anything like that, are narratives that uh, uh, come to fruition from the player planning or surprising themselves or discovering a moment in a game. Often, a designer can set up overlapping systems or other means of creating emergent narrative that we'll talk about in just a sec. But essentially, these narratives feel very personal because they are not narratives that any writer or designer has explicitly authored or has explicitly planned out. They can make the player feel like a badass or like many other emotions. So, how do you tell these kinds of stories? Well, the trick is you don't. Uh, Unlike linear narratives and branching narratives, emergent narratives aren't things that you tell. They are things that your players create for themselves. And that can be a little scary because you are relinquishing control over your narrative in many ways to your players. But it can also be incredibly rewarding if done well, because players can have a much more personal relationship to the stories that they find and discover for themselves, and will want to share those stories with each other, since not everyone's story will be the same through any playthrough of a game. But if you wanted to go about crafting opportunities for these kinds of stories, I can think of a couple different suggestions or best practices for thinking about crafting emergent narrative, or rather, I should say, crafting opportunity for emergent narrative to take place. So when I think, and this is painting with very broad strokes, but when I think there are opportunities for emergence, they come in the forms of systems, multiplayer, and randomness. We'll kind of go through each of these one by one. You don't have to have all three of these at any given time, but these are the kinds of things that I have found in successful games at Emergent Storytelling create opportunities. So, systems set up the rules for player discovery. Systems, loosely defined, are the rules and mechanics of a play space that with which the player can interact. Whether that's environmental systems or character systems or AI systems or anything like that. And the beauty of systems is not just in their implementation, but in their combination, discovery, and overlapping. A player learns the rules of a possibility space within a game and then can use those rules, use their knowledge of those rules to try new things and encounter new scenarios. There are a couple quotes here. I'll just go ahead and read them. First, a quote from Eric Zimmerman from his book Rules of Play. Complexity is intrinsically linked to meaningful play. Playing a game is synonymous with exploring a game's space of possibility. If a system is fixed, periodic, or chaotic, it does not provide a space of possibility large or flexible enough for players to explore through meaningful play. So essentially what I think of that is a possibility space has to strike the correct balance between being understandable without being entirely predictable. So if it's too static, it's easy for a player to get bored. But if it's too chaotic, there's no reference point for the player to understand a consistency throughout the systems of the game so that they can make use of and understand how systems function and how they can overlap with one another. I'll go ahead and read the other quote here. This is Warren Spector of Deus Ex and Thief and a lot of these kinds of very systems-driven games. His quote is, "When we're at our best as game designers, we can even create systems that allow users to set in motion events that we don't control, can't anticipate, and didn't plan for. And that's when things get really interesting." So this is a quote from Warren Spector, who's a master of this kind of design. And essentially what it breaks down to is designing without a total understanding of exactly what could happen. You need to have a very particular understanding so that you can know what systems are fun and engaging and worth putting in, but the delight can often come for a designer when things aren't anticipated. So, for example, stealth games use this a lot. The Deus Ex series or the Metal Gear series. Often emergence can come from having multiple plans of attack, whether you go in loud or stealth around, and there's an opportunity for planning and executing on a stealth plan, especially in a game here like Deus Ex. Your different powers and approaches and even lethal versus non-lethal ways of interaction can set up really interesting chain reactions and stories that progress through. So just as an example from these games, if I saw these two guards and could think of multiple different ways to approach the situation, whether that's to go in guns blazing, to try to find an air vent or a box to hide underneath, or a wall to sneak around behind, all of these things let me create a plan, understanding the systems of the game. Guards will hear you or listen for you. Cameras might have visibility of you, but those cameras might be able to be hacked. You might be able to throw objects that guards could hear and move away from. An understanding of all of those systems allow the player to have enough of an idea of the consistency of the world such that they can construct a plan and execute on it, and sometimes to delightful surprise. The Hitman series is another great example of this kind of emergent storytelling, especially their new episodic games where multiple different approaches are emphasized. And in fact, it's one large play space for every mission, which encourages multiple runs, taking different approaches, hitting different objectives, whether it's the disguise systems, the physics systems of the game where you can drop targets or other people off of things, the different real-world machinery and other objects that kind of interact. For example, poison interacts with food, people interact with wood chippers, all manner of other systems to create emergent stories. And then finally, it allows players to, once they fully understand a system, to create either humorous or very clever solutions to problems in and of themselves. This, for example, is Metal Gear Solid 5, wherein a player can set up a blow-up dummy of themselves and in this case has bamboozled an enemy with multiple clones of themselves, tricking the enemy into not understanding which snake and even is the correct one. And even though this breaks the illusion of like the suspension of disbelief a little bit, it's still a delightful story that a player will cherish, perhaps even more than any one authored story that was finely tuned by a writer. One good part of systems, or a very important part to think about, is the concept of affordance. Affordance is a design term referring to an understanding of how something should be used based on a person's context for using the thing. In games, we essentially use affordance to talk about leveraging what players already know, using sensible design to save you time on exposition and explanation for a game's systems, so that you can get right to the emergent play and leverage a player's understanding of the world rather than needing to explain in its entirety how a world works the first time a player experiences it. It lets you get right to the chase on emergent play. The classic example, by the way, of affordance is the door handle example, where ideally I should be able, if a door is well designed, I should be able to walk up and just by looking at the handle, understand how to open that door, whether it's a pull handle, a turn handle, or one of those push bars. The visual and tactile design of things, objects in our world, and ideally systems in our game, should lend themselves to easy understanding by the player, no matter whether they have been exposed to the game before or not. So a great example of player affordance comes in the recent Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and affordance comes through their chemistry system, wherein things that interact in the game interact as we expect they would in the real world, which lets the player get right to it when it comes to trying things out. So, for example, things catch fire. Fire will also create updrafts as heat would in the real world. Updrafts which allow you to pull out your paraglider and soar on them and create new vantage points and new ways of attacking situations. That is a totally comprehensible and understandable thing once the player gets the hang of it. For example, electricity exists in the world as well, and whether that's enemies or lightning or your own electric weapons, and just as we expect, electricity functions conducting through metal, and that can be good and bad. You, if you're carrying metal, can be struck by lightning, but you can also come up with really clever solutions to puzzles by stringing together this, I don't know if you can see, but this is a string of metal weapons that the player has used to conduct a trail of electricity from one pod to another to solve a dungeon puzzle. This is not the intended solution in the design of the dungeon. There are other switches that allow you to do this, but this allows for really emergent creation and creative problem solving. Similarly, rain happens in the game, and rain is a system that changes a lot of the other systems in interesting ways. For example, the climbing system, you might slip. The lightning that often accompanies rain means you have to be careful when using metal weaponry. And so rain like that allows you to combine lots of different systems to solve problems in interesting ways once you understand how they work. So, for example, it has started raining, so I'm unable to climb a cliff, but maybe once it rains, I'll throw my metal weapon into a patch of grass such that when lightning strikes it, the grass catches fire, and when that fire spreads, it creates enough updraft for me to hop on my paraglider and soar up the cliff. That's like a great example of combining systems so that you can have new experiences. And these, again, are experiences that were not necessarily explicitly intended by any writer or designer, but is an incredibly cool story for the player to take away and feel like they very personally and triumphantly accomplished a given scenario. Other games do this as well. Far Cry, for example, has elephants, which can interact with NPCs in interesting ways when unleashed into enemy camps. No writer is saying, here's exactly what an elephant is going to go do, but the elephant has a system of event listeners and callouts in place such that when released into a given camp or when put into place with other NPCs, interesting things happen. The other classic example is The Sims. Pools have ladders, but removing a ladder removes a Sim's ability to get out of a pool. And even though there's a little bit of suspension of disbelief there of whether a Sim should be able to get out of a pool on their own, once a player understands the rule of the game, this kind of story becomes possible, not as one explicitly intended by a designer, but one that players discovered and then took wild advantage of as The Sims became popular. All right, thing number 2 for emergent play, multiplayer. Surprise through competition and cooperation. Emergence is about fostering unpredictability in a lot of ways, and these final 2 terms, other than systems, have to do with that. In this case, we're talking about unpredictability of other people. Multiplayer does not need to be present in every emergent experience, but can really help. A great recent example is PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. For folks who don't know, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds is a battle royale game similar now to Fortnite and other battle royale games of the genre, wherein 100 players skydive down onto an enclosed island, each starting with no gear at all and have to scavenge for gear and medical supplies and armor and everything they need to be the last person standing on the island. And this is a play space where, not just by the systems in play, but by the other players, creates a vast opportunity for emergent storytelling and emergent play, because other people are unpredictable. And when other people interact with one another and come into contact with one another, you get a lot of really interesting scenarios that can be created from this game. It's partly why this game became very popular for streaming as well, because different experiences were different. And you could get something from watching other people play that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get from just playing it yourself, as would be the case in a more linearly authored game or even a branching narrative. You could just go back and try all the paths. It's not as far-reaching of the possibility space as it is when other players are getting in and causing all kinds of chaos. Battlegrounds case, the emergence comes not just from the systems but from other players, wherein the tension that is created in this game, and it's slightly different from other battle royale games of the genre. Fortnite, for example, has a slightly lower emphasis on tension and a slightly higher emphasis on arcadey, skill-based building creativity or kind of adrenaline-fueled action. Battlegrounds tends to lead towards, yes, a different kind of adrenaline, but often a more tense adrenaline rather than simply arcadey jump and shoot action of Fortnite. For example, when you're in a combat encounter and have different mobility systems, you can dive out of a window, or you can hop into a vehicle, or if you are other players are around and you need to hide, one of the best solutions for hiding inside of a house is to hide in a bathtub. The player's mesh is small enough that in the bathtub of houses, it's easier to get down prone. Similar with a bush, players can submerge themselves in a bush, and if you're really creative, you'll put your bush in your car. Essentially, all of these different things create tense and exciting moments simply by nature of the other players being there. They are multiplayer emergence that comes from a shared thrill of existing in this world and trying to survive that leads to stories of your own. One of which I will tell right now as an example of a story that, again, was not authored explicitly by anyone, but is one that I came upon in my own doing. So early in my career of PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, I was very poor at the game. In fact, I did not grow up as a PC gamer, and so had very little skill with a mouse and keyboard. I was much more comfortable with a controller in my hands. But I made my way over to PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds because I felt like I had to try it out. And in this instance, it was raining. And rain was a very interesting case in PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds because rain obscures both vision and audio response. making it harder to hear other players as they come around. So in this instance, I made my way down, hadn't seen anyone, had a measly little pistol, but encountered finally a river. And thankfully, I encountered this river because the blue wall that was enclosing made its way towards me, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to outrun it for much longer. But I found this boat in the middle of the river, and I look around and I don't see anybody around, so I went down and I hopped into this boat. I am tooling around and freaking out because this boat is incredibly loud. I gun it, and so drive down the river as fast as possible because I'm worried other people will hear me. I clear out from the wall, thankfully, and I drive forward. And pretty soon I encounter this little bridge right across the river. And I'm pulling up to this bridge, trying to keep an eye out for if there are any players on top of the bridge because I'm scared. I don't really have any good guns. I'm making a heck of a lot of noise with this boat driving down the river, but it's my only chance of survival, especially to tool away from the enclosing circle. So I pull really slowly up to this bridge. I see, sure enough, someone up there moving. I pull the engine down to a stop, hop over into the side seat, and very carefully point my little pistol up at the guy. I can see him crouched behind a little box. I pop a couple shots right at him, and I can see him get hit and have no idea from where he's being hit. He spins around, he looks the other way on the bridge, and then he ducks into cover, looking down the bridge, whereas I'm down and behind him. He has no idea that I'm shooting him from that angle, and he's clearly trying to see who was shooting him from across the bridge when I was being stealthy from down below. So I give him a couple more shots, and thankfully he goes down. I'm really excited. And then I turn around, and what is enclosing on me again but the wall. So I hop in and I drive forward. And there's a fair amount of fear here because that guy, I forgot to mention before I killed him, he got off a couple of shots. Bink, 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 all the way down to almost no health. He was hiding for a little bit, but then managed to see where I was and managed to get into a good place of cover. So I gunned it back down the river because I knew I was really in danger, but thank goodness I'm safe with just this tiny little bit of health left. And I'm feeling great. I feel like I escaped a scenario. I'm a triumphant guy. I have a little bit of health left, and I pull my boat up onto the beach and hop out. Not realizing that when you hop out of a boat, momentum is obtained, and the boat continues to move. And I hop out on the beach, and the boat rolls right over me, and that last little bit of health goes to zero, and I die alone on the beach, pathetically. And what I noticed is in the kill feed, where normally it says so-and-so was shot by so-and-so with an assault rifle or a shotgun or whatever, it just said Grant was killed by boat. The most embarrassing little death in this scene. But it was amazing. I will cherish that story forever, and that's not something that could have happened had I not been engaging with the multiplayer and physics systems of the game. That wouldn't have worked as a linearly authored narrative. It was only something that would have worked in my experience, and is now something that I really enjoy remembering, and even though it was an embarrassing loss, is a personal and deliciously crafted story that I am sharing with you guys and will treasure when I think of PUBG all the time. The last thing I want to talk about with Emergence is randomness, shake things up. This is another way to create unexpected scenarios without needing other people. A great example of this is in Minecraft. The procedurally generated world creates lots of opportunity for interesting experiences, even with or without other players joining you in your Minecraft server. Happening upon incredibly, sublimely large caves or really interesting mountain experiences or all kinds of very cool environments, all of which are randomly procedurally generated, not entirely randomly, but have a large degree of randomness in their generation, can craft really interesting experiences that are personal to you. When you come upon a cave like this in Minecraft with lava flowing down and water meeting it, you feel like it's your discovery and it's something that is personal to you because it really is. It's a randomly generated cave that no other player, unless you invite them to this cave, will experience in exactly the same way, which creates a really
unique and personal thing for you, including plenty of hilarious stories when you are digging straight down into a cave and happen to dig straight down into lava, or when you are exploring and then it gets dark out before you intend, and the randomly generated landscape is not one that you remember as well as you think. All of these things contribute to a player having a personalized experience rather than simply a specific one that every other player would experience. There are elements of randomness in other games too. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds creates player stories based on what loot is around wherever you drop. That makes a big difference in your experience of the game and is something that, to a very high degree, will shape player experience as they play through a given map. And again, is a big reason why watching other people play remains engaging, because they are having different experiences from what you are having. Randomness also occurs in PUBG based on the red zone locations and the place that the circle spawns. Hearthstone as well is a really interesting example, because the randomness of cards that you draw from your deck, even though it is not what many would think of as a story-driven game, Hearthstone very much emphasizes player stories in the context of a given match, where your story is your triumph or defeat at the hands of your opponent, and the thrilling way which you drew the clutch card that you needed, or the unlucky hand that you got, or the unlucky sequence of events that led to a stunning upset or anything like that. There's a great talk by Hearthstone director Eric Dodds from GDC called Player Stories, talking about how they used randomness and other elements in Hearthstone to help facilitate these kinds of player stories. All of this I've been hinting at it a little bit, but it relates directly to watchability and watchable game design. This is something else that I've been very passionate about. Emergent storytelling is by far the best outlet for watchable game design, because any more linear narrative, or even a branching narrative of multiple linear paths, is going to be relatively similar from player to player. Whereas emergence, whether it's the emergence from a competitive match like League of Legends or Dota or CSGO or anything like that, or the emergence from a game like Minecraft or Grand Theft Auto Online, or any other experience that creates a different story for different people every time you play, is really what draws crowds and is really what incentivizes people to watch other people play. And this is augmented by the kind of emergent storytelling that you get from streamers that are either particularly skilled or particularly entertaining. The stories that they generate are often either more exciting or more hilarious, or they'll come up with kooky plans and ideas and different novel ways to approach games. And often they might even come up with things that you want to take back to a game yourself, or it might just be something that you are delighted to watch, since it wouldn't necessarily be an experience that you could just enforce having on your own, unlike a linear narrative that is going to play out the same way every time. So that's why games like Minecraft, and then more recently League of Legends, Fortnite is an incredible example. All of these games have taken over Twitch and YouTube, is because they have systems in place for novel storytelling that creates incredibly exciting or emotional or fun water cooler moments that people get to feel like they are sharing and are a part of as they experience them with a streamer or an esports professional or anything else like that. This is a hugely interesting trend in the industry right now, by the way, and is something that lots of people are very excited about and thinking about when it comes to crafting watchable games and using watchable design in interesting ways. So, yeah, some final takeaways here. First and foremost, emergent narratives aren't mutually exclusive with other types of narratives. I would even classify moments of emergent narrative in what are more broadly linear narratives. For example, the Uncharted games or a Halo solo campaign or anything like that. Even though the overarching story is linear and will play out the same way for every player, particular encounters might not, and there are often opportunities for little bits of emergence even inside linear branching or other types of narrative structure. Emergence I think of as an ingredient to add, not simply an exclusive quality about a narrative. Secondly, allowing players to discover, create their own stories hugely pumps up player engagement. A player feels much often, it can go either way, and this is painting with a broad brush, but often a player feels incredibly engaged to a much higher degree when they feel like they are the one interacting with their experience and crafting their experience for themselves. It is one of the unique elements of games to allow a player personal input on their experience and how things go. That's kind of one of the core tenets of games, and so it's really exciting to think of narrative as operating in the same way, where individualized stories based on player input or discovery or happenstance create personal experiences. And then finally, it is a little scary because as a designer, you are in some senses abdicating the right to perfectly fine tune a story as you will, but it's totally worthwhile because of the payoff you get of crafting emergent systems that encourage players to play and interact with. So thank you so much. The rest of this video has a brief Q&A. I'm afraid I won't be able to reverse engineer the questions and answers from my own lip syncing, so I'm going to go ahead and say bye for now. But thank you guys so much, and be sure to get in touch with Harvard Game Devs if you have any more questions about this stuff. My name is Grant, and thanks for watching. thoughts.
Yeah. All right, see you guys.
Later, my friend. There you go. Fun stuff.
Thank you. I love it.
Thanks. Well, I think it's cool. Hopefully that's something to think about. I love it. It's cool. I would go, also, if folks are interested about more of this kind of stuff, I have both thoughts or, more importantly, links to other people's more eloquently put together thoughts about this kind of stuff, which I love. Excellent. Shall we meet? Do we have stuff?
Well, one last.
Oh.